Today's lecture is about the vascular supply of the central nervous system, and this means that I will discuss the arterial supply of the brains and the spinal cord, but also the venous drainage of these organs. I have divided the lecture in 3 parts. I will start with a short discussion of the meninges, you know, the membranes which cover the brain, because many of the vessels to the brain and the spinal cord are topographically closely related to the meninges. So these are very important to understand. Then we'll discuss the venous system. So we'll have a look at some of the intracranial venous sinuses, but also you should be aware that there's an enormous venous system surrounding the spinal cord. It's called plexus venosus vertebralis internus because it's long term. We prefer the English abbreviation, which is IVVP, internal venous vertebral plexus. And then we go to the arterial system. I give a short overview and I will discuss 2 specific parts. One is about the vascular territories and variations in it. And then I think the last 15 minutes I will discuss the regulation of the cerebral blood flow, which is very important. It has to be regulated precisely, and it's also difficult aspects. I will try to give the main lines of this. But now let's start with the meninges. I understood from Anton that you already studied the meninges, is that right? Okay, so I tell you nothing new if I say the outermost of the 3 is called the dura mater, and you probably know that the dura mater has 2 layers. But it's good to understand that the outermost layer of the dura mater is nothing else than the periosteum, which lines the inside of the skull. But this periosteum is fused with the true dura mater layer, and therefore we say it has 2 layers. It's a double-layered structure, but the outer layer actually is the periosteum. The dura, of course, has a vascular supply, and several arteries are involved. The largest one is the arteria meningia media, the middle meningeal artery. And as you can see, it is situated between the skull and the dura mater. And therefore it not only supplies the dura, but also the skull. In many cases, anatomy is quite logical. So if you see an artery passing a structure, the chance is very big that it's supplying this structure. So when this artery is running between the dura and the skull, it will supply both structures. On this section, this cross section, we see the other membranes. So this is the skin, this is the skull, this is the double-layered dura mater. And then we have the second membrane. It's called the arachnoidea mater or arachnoid. You see it's closely adherent to the dura mater. And this is the pia mater, you will know that one, which follows the brain surface precisely. It precisely follows the surface, it follows the gyri, it follows the sulci. But you see there's a connection between arachnoid and pia mater, because from the membranous part of the arachnoid, connective tissue strands are sent down. They connect to the pia, they are called the trabeculae of the arachnoid, and therefore there is some space between the arachnoid and the pia, some space between the trabecula, and this is called the subarachnoid space, spatium subarachnoidale. And we'll see more of that in a few seconds. Next slide, next drawing is similar, but we see more details. So the first thing we see that there are places where the double-layered dura mater divides. It just does like this. It divides, and then we have an intradural compartment. And this intradural compartment, it's lined with endothelium. There are no smooth muscle cells, only endothelium. And this is the well-known venous sinus. We have many venous sinuses inside the skull. And these venous sinuses collect the blood from the brain, but also from the skull. Again, logics, it also comes from the skull. So we see veins which are running on the surface of the brain, and you see they penetrate this innermost dural layer and then they open into the venous sinus. These veins are called anchor veins because they kind of anchor the brain surface to the dura mater. You see that also the skull drains into the venous sinuses, but it's very important to notice there are veins that connect the venous sinuses to veins on the outside of the skull. So there are anastomoses between veins inside and veins outside. Such veins are called venae emissariae, emissary veins, because it's a kind of emission outside the skull. They are sent out of the skull. And these are clinically important, and I will come back to that in several minutes. So, what else do we see? So, well, now maybe I will try to ask some of you a question. Whom of you can help me and point the epidural space? One of you, perhaps? Would you want to try? I always do it in Holland. I'm very kind. If it doesn't work, it's not a problem. Who knows the epidural space? Have you learned about the epidural space? Spatium epidurale. No, not yet. They have it yet? Yes, that one. Yeah, excellent, excellent. Well done, well done, well done. So, well, to be honest, it's labeled here, epidural space. But you see, there is no space at all, because the epidural space is a potential space. It's a virtual space. It means only under certain conditions, under pathological conditions, it becomes a space. For example, when blood collects between skull and dura, then there's a real space. So the epidural space is a potential space, and the same holds true for the spatium subdurale, or the subdural space, which is a space, a potential space between the dura mater and the arachnoid, subdural space. To be honest, if I would have made this drawing, I would have drawn the arachnoid closer to the dura, because now it gives the impression that there is some space, but normally there is not such a space. Again, only under pathological conditions you will have a true subdural space. Then, do you know the cerebrospinal fluid, the liquor cerebrospinalis? It is situated here. The liquor cerebrospinalis is situated in the subarachnoid space. And this means that the blood vessels which run on the surface of the brain, arteries and veins, are directly surrounded by the cerebrospinal fluids. They're just in the middle of this cerebrospinal fluid. You see extensions of the arachnoids going into the venous sinuses. They look a bit like a cauliflower. I don't know if you know this vegetables, cauliflower. And they're called granulationes arachnoidales. They are important for resorption of the liquor, because the production of liquor is about half a liter a day, and the amount of volume that can contain liquor inside the brain is only 150 milliliters. It means there has to be a big turnover. It's very important, otherwise the pressure would increase. So there's a lot of resorption going on, and these are specialized structures for this resorption. The next slide, it gives an impression of the anchor vein. So what have we done? We have lifted up the dura mater. This is the shiny appearance of the arachnoid, is still there, and underneath the arachnoid we have the veins which run on the brain surface, and you see how they enter this sinus. This sinus is called the superior sagittal sinus, and therefore the brain is anchored to the dura. So this is a nice view of these anchor veins. So back to the liquor. I've shown you something about the resorption of the liquor, but of course it has to be produced as well. And it is produced inside the brain, inside the ventricles of the brain. We have 4 ventricles, 4 spaces inside the brain, and each of them contains a so-called plexus choroideus, a choroid plexus, and that's where the liquor is produced. So you can see, this is, I'm quite sure you are familiar with such an image. It's a mid-sagittally sectioned brain and spinal cord, This is the third ventricle, this is the fourth ventricle, this is one of the lateral ventricles. And you can see these reddish structures in the ventricles called plexus choroideus, and they produce the liquor about half a liter a day. And to reach the subarachnoid space, they can only do that through the fourth ventricle, because there are several foramina called foramen of Magendie and the foramina of Luschka. Have you learned them already? Does that ring a bell, those names? Okay, that's great. And that brings the liquor to the subarachnoid space, and then it can be resorbed. Now briefly about three pathological conditions. First, the so-called epidural hemorrhage. It's a bleeding, and due to this bleeding, a true epidural space occurs. It means something is bleeding between the skull and the dura mater. Does anyone have an idea which structure may bleed, which artery or vein may bleed? Very good, the middle meningeal artery, that's the one. So it's caused by a rupture of the arteria meningia media. And of course, such an artery does not rupture automatically. You need a trauma for that, and normally it's combined with a fracture of the skull. It's very dangerous because it's an arterial bleeding. It's very dangerous. And here you see a picture from the pathology department. It's a superior view. We have removed the skull cap. This is the dura mater, and this is the blood clot, which is on top of the dura, between the skull and the dura mater. So now we have a true epidural space. Normally, you can see a very sharp boundary, a very sharp delineation of this clot. And it's also visible on radiological images. We have a radiologist from Germany here, and I'm sure that he knows these images, because the point is, you know, the skull bones are connected by a certain type of joints called the sutures. You know them, the suturae between the skull bones. These are not synovial joints like shoulder, elbow or whatever with a lot of mobility. These are so-called fibrous joints. It means the skull bones are connected by short fibrous tissue strands between the bones. And this fibrous tissue is also connected with the periosteum underneath. And the periosteum underneath is the outermost layer of the dura. So the sutures are a natural boundary for this epidural hematoma. And therefore, it's there the dura is very closely adherent to the bone, and you cannot detach it easily. For that reason, normally such a hematoma has a sharp boundary. Now, second example, the subdural hematoma. It means we have created a true subdural space, and this can be caused by the rupture of an anchor vein. So it's a venous bleeding, so it doesn't go as quickly as this epidural bleeding. You need a trauma as well, but sometimes even in especially in older people, a minor trauma may be sufficient, like knocking your head, because when you grow older, your brain may shrink a little bit. And this means that the distance from the brain surface to the venous sinuses increases. And this means that the anchor veins have to run a longer distance to reach the venous sinuses. It makes them more fragile. And if people, for example, are using drugs, anticoagulant drugs, it makes them very vulnerable. And then a small rupture may happen. You have a very slow venous bleeding, which in the end, of course, gives a problem. So this is just an example. This is a subdural hematoma. No sharp boundary. Now we have removed the dura as well. And this is the shiny arachnoid, and you see there's blood on it. A third example is the subarachnoidal hemorrhage. And the subarachnoidal hemorrhage, of course, it's bleeding in the subarachnoid space, and we have seen that blood vessels run inside the subarachnoid space, surrounded by liquor. And the best known cause of a subarachnoid bleeding is the rupture of an aneurysma. Do you know what an aneurysma is?
It's a weakened endothelial wall.
Sorry?
A weakened vessel wall.
Weakened vessel, especially it's a widened part of the vessel, a dilated part of the vessel, and that gives a weakening as well. You're right, very good. So here we see the configuration of arteries at the base of the skull. We come back to that in about half an hour, I guess. And you see a widening, an aneurysm, in this case of the internal carotid artery, and this is another example. In this case, it's a dilation of the vertebral artery. And if such an aneurysm ruptures, you will have an arterial bleeding inside the subarachnoid space. Okay, so this was the first part of the lecture, the part about membranes, to make this clear, because we need this knowledge for the rest of the lecture. So now we go to the venous system, starting with the venous system of the brain. And considering the venous system of the brain, we have to distinguish a superficial system and a deep system. The superficial system is not so difficult to understand. Actually, we have seen it already. It consists of the veins that are running on the brain surface and drain into the venous sinuses by the anchor veins. So they're just underneath the arachnoid. And it's logical to understand that they drain the cortex, but also the subcortical white matter, but especially the superficial parts of the brain. But of course we have deeper parts of the brains, and they should be drained as well. So there's a deep venous system as well. And well, there are several deep veins with names like the internal cerebral vein. Personally, I think it's a bit too specialistic to remember it all, but anyway. To my Dutch students, I'd say, well, I will be very glad if you understand that all the deep veins come together in one big vein, and that one is called the vena cerebri magna, or the great cerebral vein. And this great cerebral vein continues into one specific sinus. It's called the sinus rectus, which translates into English as the straight sinus. And that brings us to the intracranial venous sinuses. So they're just passive, single venous tubes, collecting tubes, intradural spaces lined by endothelium. I'm not going through them all. I'm sure that you will have to learn most of them from atlases and from practicals. But for example, this is a superior sagittal sinus which runs down, and this is the straight sinus which I just discussed. They come together here, and in a superior view we'll see this. This is the straight sinus which drains the blood from the deepest part of the brain, and this is superior sagittal sinus. Then it comes together here, and to the left and to the right there's a transverse sinus which goes into another sinus, and finally the blood leaves the skull through the foramen jugulare, and then we find under the skull base the beginning of the internal jugular vein, the vena jugularis interna, which is the main collecting vein of the head and the neck region. So this is an interesting point, because we see many veins coming here together, and quite often it is supposed to be a so-called common venous pool, because we have the entrance of the superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus. There is some venous pool, and to the left and right the transverse sinuses leave. But these are schemes from a very old publication, almost a century ago. But in anatomy that's not a problem, because I can assure you that the anatomy of the human being has not changed dramatically over the last 100 years. And I'm pretty sure that it won't change dramatically over the next 100 years. So simple, descriptive publications of anatomy are still valuable. And this is a very nice example, because they investigated the configuration of this common venous pool. Actually, this is the common venous pool, with the superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus coming in, and left and right transverse sinuses leaving. But you see, it's only present in 9% of the people. In most people, there's a kind of separation, a kind of division. but in such a way that blood from the superior sagittal sinus goes to the right transverse sinus, and blood from the straight sinus goes to the left transverse sinus. And that's interesting. And if we take a careful look, the drawer this time was not so bad, because the superior sagittal sinus kind of continues as the right transverse sinus, whilst the straight sinus continues as the left transverse sinus. And that's interesting, because it means that blood which comes from the cortex of the brains goes to the right. It goes through the right internal jugular vein, and blood which comes from the deep parts of the brains, it goes to the left internal jugular vein. I'm not aware of any clinical implication actually, but I think it's a nice thing to know. And you can even notice this on radiological images, because quite often you see that the right transverse sinus is a little bit wider than the left one, because more blood returns from the cortex than returns from the deep part of the brain. Okay, now there is one specific sinus which I want to discuss in detail, and that is this one. It's called the cavernous sinus, sinus cavernosus. First, you see it does not only receive blood from the brain, but also from the orbit. Orbital veins drain into this cavernous sinus. Here on the right side, this cavernous sinus has been opened, and now we see a very special thing. It looks as if structures just pass through the cavernous sinus. And that is what is really happening. If you make a frontal section in this position, we'll have this image. So this is the pituitary gland, the optic chiasm above it, the sphenoid bone and the sphenoid sinus is below. And this is one cavernous sinus, and this is the other cavernous sinus. So this cavernous sinus is not a single venous tube like all the other sinuses. It's a plexus of veins. You see, anatomical studies by injecting stains into the venous system have made this clear. It's a plexus of veins, and therefore structures are able to pass through it. Otherwise, this internal carotid artery could never pass through the cavernous sinus. And also the abducens nerve is running through the cavernous sinus. And you see several other cranial nerves are in the lateral wall. And this means that pathology inside the cavernous sinus can have several symptoms related to these nerves. It's a nice story perhaps to realize why this sinus is called the cavernous sinus. You know, anatomy is a very old discipline, and anatomists have been dissecting for centuries and describing the human body precisely. And when for the first time, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries ago, I don't know precisely, anatomists opened the cavernous sinus, they saw many small holes, small let me say, yes, holes filled with blood. And that reminded them to the corpus cavernosum of the penis, the cavernous body of the penis, which of course has many small spaces filled with blood. So it's quite funny that the cavernous sinus is called after the penis. So even in those days, the anatomists tried to connect the brain to the penis. But this is also clinically important. It's an important structure because it takes me to the next drawing. You see, this drawer did it quite well. He drew a venous plexus, and you see how it's also connected to the facial vein through the orbital veins. This picture actually is about the intra-extracranial anastomosis. I mentioned the existence of emissary veins in the previous slides, and this is a very important connection between veins outside the skull and the veins inside the skull. You know, the facial vein, vena facialis, I'm not really sure if you already have studied this vein. It's one of the large draining veins of the area outside the skull. It drains both facial veins, left and right ones, drain this part of the face. And you see they are connected to the cavernous sinus by the veins in the orbit. Now, a good thing to realize is that the veins in the head and neck don't have valves. You may know that the veins in our legs, in our lower limbs, they need valves to help the blood return to the heart because it has to go against gravity. But normally, when we're walking upright, the gravity is helping to return the blood to the heart. Of course, if we're walking on our hands, which we do quite often, it becomes more difficult. And you may know the feeling, if you're doing this for quite a while, that it feels swollen, it feels congested in your head, because we don't have valves, and then the gravity is working against it. But this also means, because there are no valves, that the blood may run into two directions. And this may become a problem under certain conditions, because if you have an inflammation, one of the signs of inflammation is edema, as you know, which is a swelling. And therefore, sometimes the blood may choose a different direction. And instead of going down, it may go into the orbit and to the cavernous sinus and then leave in another way. And this might be a problem if the inflammation is caused by infection. And a very well-known process, which is the cause, is a furuncle. A furuncle is an abscess of the follicle of a hair. So that we see most furuncles close to the nose and to the upper lip because we have many hairs there. And infectious material from such a furuncle may go into the cavernous sinus. They can cause a thrombosis inside the cavernous sinus, can even cause meningitis, and this is very dangerous. And before the era of antibiotics, people could die of that. And there's a well-known German saying, I have to say, I think it comes into various variants. Ein Furunkel auf der Nase nach 3 Tagen unter dem Rasen. It would translate as, when you have a furuncle in your nose or close to your nose, you will be under grass in 3 days. You will be dead in 3 days. And that really could happen in those days before the antibiotics. So, and this is still relevant. This knowledge is still relevant because still furuncles may spread into the cavernous sinus. Something that should be known. Okay, now we make a move. We are going to leave the skull. We're going to make a move to the spine and the spinal cord. And you see, if you go here actually, you see here that there's kind of a continuation of the venous sinuses into a venous plexus. And this is the plexus venosus vertebralis internus, or the IVVP. It's an enormous, voluminous venous system surrounding the spinal cord, inside the vertebral column, which runs from the foramen magnum of the skull, so it runs from the venous sinuses, and goes down until the level of the pelvis. And you can see here how big it is. There are many connections with veins outside the vertebral column. And for example, it's the existence of this IVVP which explains that the carcinoma of a prostate can give metastasis in vertebrae so easily, because it goes through this IVVP. Pelvic veins are connected to this plexus, and then they can go up. And because the flow in such a plexus is always very low, you can have some retrograde flow into the body of a vertebra, and then you have a metastasis. On the next slide, it's the second lumbar vertebra. So we're just below the ending of the spinal cord. We're seeing the well-known cauda equina, surrounded by the dura mater, and you see how big the veins of this plexus are. By the way, we can see very well in this slide that the dura mater surrounding the spinal cord and the cauda equina only has one layer and not two layers, as is the case around the brain. Because nowhere there is a connection or a fusion between the real dura and the periosteum, which would line the vertebral canal. So we have a true epidural space everywhere inside the vertebral canal, and this epidural space would compare to the intradural compartments, which has the venous sinuses around the brain. So that is a difference. That is a difference that you should keep in mind. Around the brain, we don't have a true epidural space, only under pathological conditions. The intradural compartments, they contain the venous sinuses. And when you compare it to the spinal cord, then the intradural compartment, it continues as the space between the true dura and the periosteum, but now it's called epidural space. It means epidural anesthesia, it goes through this ligament and it goes into this area. That's the difference. Why did I put in this cervical spine? Because in the cervical spine, the IVVP has a very smart biomechanical function. If you look at the body closely at particular parts, you will find many smart, many neat biomechanical systems. And one of them is happening here. You see, this is the cervical spine, and rotation in the cervical spine like this can be almost 90 degrees. And slightly more of it is between the first and the second cervical vertebra, which means between the atlas and the axis. So this would be a normal cervical vertebra with a vertebral body. But the first and the second are different. This is the first one, the atlas. It doesn't have a vertebral body, so it has arches on the anterior and the posterior side. And this is the axis, the second one, which has a body, but on top of the body is a so-called dens. And this dens, it is situated against the anterior arch. So if you put them together, we have to look at this part of the drawing. It's a superior view of the atlas, and this is the dens, which is making contact with the anterior arch. And this dens is held in position by a very strong ligament called the transverse ligament of the atlas. So when you rotate between the atlas and the axis, which comprises a lot of the rotation in the cervical spine, you see that the center of rotation is eccentric. Of course, it cannot be in the center because the spinal cord has to be in the center. So the center of rotation is eccentric. And this means if you rotate, that this area inside, the area of the vertebral canal, it tends to decrease. And last week I tried to make a very quick movie of that. I just want to show it. Here it is. I have to start again. So this is the atlas, this is the axis, and now I hold them together and I try to rotate, and you see that this area is really decreasing. I try to do it again. You see it's decreasing. So that of course is very dangerous, would you think, because it would mean you could have some compression on the spinal cord. But we all know that this does not happen, because I can do this easily and still walk around happily without falling down. So there is no compression on the spinal cord. And it is possible because of the presence of this IVVP. This IVVP gives such a big volume of blood surrounding the spinal cord that when I do this, I'm just emptying my veins. I'm pushing the blood out of my veins. It's a volume buffer, a buffer for volume. And when I do it again, it fills again. Also, this was demonstrated by radiology. You could see how this IVVP empties when you do this and how it fills again when you do this. A very smart system of this IVVP.